The year was 1942, while the world's attention was fixed on the scorching sands of North Africa and the steaming jungles of Guadalcanal. A secret, brutal war was being fought in a landscape utterly hostile to human life, the Aleutian Islands. This 1,100-mile chain of volcanic rock stretching westward from Alaska was often called the Adak-Nal, or the WWII War, a WWII being a sudden, violent coastal wind. This was America's only theater of operations where Axis powers occupied North American soil. The enemy was not just the Japanese Imperial Army, it was the environment itself. The Aleutians were defined by an oppressive, perpetual cold and a dense pea-soup fog that could roll in faster than any Zero, reducing visibility to zero in seconds. Winds routinely exceeded 100 miles per hour, and temperatures hovered near freezing, making every maneuver, air, land, or sea, a life-or-death gamble with the elements. The constant moisture caused trench foot, froze equipment, and drove men to the brink of insanity. In June 1942, the Japanese struck the Aleutians, occupying the remote western islands of Attu and Kiska. The strategic value was minimal, but the psychological impact was enormous, a foothold on American territory. The ensuing U.S. response was a slow, deliberate, and terrifying campaign. The Battle of Attu, fought in May 1943, was a bloody disaster for the Japanese. Nearly 2,400 men died, but the American casualties were staggering for the size of the force, highlighting the desperate, unseen nature of the fight. Following the Attu victory, only Kiska remained. The intelligence suggested Kiska was a fortress held by an estimated 10,000 hardened Japanese troops, fortified with tunnels, gun emplacements, and endless booby traps. Command feared that an assault on Kiska would be a bloodbath, far exceeding the cost of Attu. The conventional forces, the infantry, the engineers, and the artillery were utterly unprepared for the unique challenges of the Aleutian battlefield. They couldn't see the enemy, they couldn't land effectively on the volcanic rock, and they certainly couldn't move silently through the dense fog and slick tundra that defined the terrain. The military needed a solution, a new kind of soldier who was immune to the psychological torture of the climate and possessed the innate ability to move through the fog and the rough volcanic landscape unseen and unheard. They needed scouts who treated the freezing environment not as an enemy, but as home. They turned to the one group of people who had navigated and survived this land for thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of Alaska. The stage was set for the formation of the Alaskan Scouts. The formation of the Alaskan Scouts was born of necessity and a sudden humble realization by the American military establishment that their high-tech warfare was useless against the natural environment of the Aleutians. They needed specialized help. The military sought out the local Aleut, Eskimo, and Athabaskan peoples of Alaska, men who had grown up hunting seal, caribou, and fish in the very conditions that were crippling the white troops from the lower 48 states. The central figure in this story, a composite of the brave individuals who served, is Sergeant Ben Tundra Kalluk. Ben was an Alaskan Native, fluent in multiple dialects, and raised in a traditional hunting village where survival depended on absolute mastery of the tundra, the sea ice, and the weather. His skills, honed since childhood, were completely foreign to the standard GI. Ben and his colleagues were recruited into the Alaskan Scouts, initially a small, highly autonomous unit of mixed heritage, Alaskan Native and Caucasian, intended for reconnaissance and long-range patrol. Their training was minimal in military doctrine, but intense in field survival. They were taught to read the fog's movement, understand the specific hazards of the slick, uneven volcanic ash and rock, and navigate using the subtle shifts of the wind and the magnetic pull of the islands, skills that rendered conventional maps and compasses obsolete in the thick Aleutian fog. The contrast between the scouts and the conventional infantry was stark. The GIs were loaded down with heavy, oil-clogged equipment, wearing wool uniforms that soaked through instantly in the constant drizzle, leading to rapid onset of trench foot and hypothermia. The Scouts, however, often preferred lighter, layered traditional gear,
sometimes supplementing their issue uniforms with custom-made sealskin or fur-lined parkas and boots. They moved with a lightness and silence that defied the terrain. While the white soldiers clumped and struggled, sinking into the tundra, the scouts seemed to float. Ben Kalluk in particular was famed for his absolute mastery of camouflage and stillness. He could disappear into a field of gray volcanic rock and sickly yellow-green tundra moss within seconds. He didn't just understand camouflage, he understood the optics of the fog, knowing exactly how light and moisture played tricks on the human eye. To the Japanese, these men were not soldiers. They were literally ghosts, slipping through the perimeter wire without sound, leaving no discernible tracks in the wet ash, and returning with intelligence so accurate it sounded impossible. The mission assigned to the Alaskan Scouts, and specifically Ben's unit, was the most dangerous reconnaissance assignment of the entire campaign. Scout the perimeter of Kiska Island, the suspected fortress, before the main invasion force could sail. They had to confirm the strength of the Japanese garrison, identify gun emplacements, and map the complex network of tunnels that command feared would turn Kiska into an underground meat grinder.
The training environment for the Alaskan Scouts was unique in the U.S. military. It was conducted not in base camps, but in the hostile, remote landscape of Adak Island, mirroring the conditions of Kiska. The goal was to discard the rigid, often counterproductive doctrines of conventional warfare and embrace the flexibility and pragmatism of frontier survival. The most essential lesson was the science of survival in the cold. Hypothermia was a more consistent killer than enemy fire. Ben Kalluk taught the others, both the native Alaskan recruits and the few white Special Forces soldiers assigned to the unit, how to manage moisture. He explained that wool and cotton were useless in the perpetual Aleutian drizzle. The secret was layering and animal fat. He demonstrated techniques for waterproofing boots using rendered seal oil and constructing temporary shelters from snow and rock that could shield them from the infamous 100-mile-per-hour willy wows. Navigation was another critical component. While the main forces relied on standard compasses, which could be wildly inaccurate due to volcanic iron and magnetic interference of the islands, the scouts relied on non-instrumental navigation. Ben taught them to read the growth patterns of moss on the volcanic rock, to use the constant presence of migrating birds, and, most importantly, to interpret the subtle, shifting density of the fog itself, predicting wind direction and geographical features by scent and sound alone. Their equipment reflected their specialized mission. They abandoned heavy standard packs for lighter, custom-made frames. Their rifles, typically the reliable M1 Garand, were stripped and meticulously cleaned with specialized oil every day, a necessity to prevent the seizing that occurred in the constant moisture and cold. They carried minimal, highly concentrated rations, often supplementing them with traditional high-calorie survival foods. Crucially, the scouts mastered the art of silent tracking and counter-tracking. The porous volcanic ash and wet tundra made conventional footprint detection impossible, but the scouts looked for subtle cues: displaced pebbles, a disturbed clump of moss, or the faint scent of charcoal from an enemy cooking fire carried on the wind. They learned to move with a distinct, shuffling gait, a low center of gravity that allowed them to glide over the slick, undulating tundra without disturbing the volcanic gravel. They were trained to operate entirely alone or in pairs, relying on hand signals and the unspoken understanding born of shared cultural heritage and extreme stress. For Sergeant Ben Kalluk, the training was simply a formal recognition of his childhood, but for the military, it was a revolution. They were turning away from technology and embracing primal skill, acknowledging that to defeat the Japanese on Kiska, they first had to survive the island itself. The knowledge Ben imparted would be the only thing standing between the main invasion force and a potential disaster. In the dead of July 1943, as the main invasion force, Operation Cottage, prepared for its massive, unprecedented assault, Ben Kalluk and his two-man scout team were the first Americans to set foot on Kiska since the Japanese occupation. Their mission was covert, dangerous, and utterly reliant on the fog. They were delivered miles offshore in the absolute darkness by a U.S. Navy submarine, the USS Wahoo. The final approach was made in a two-man inflatable kayak, paddling through the ice-cold, pitching North Pacific waves. The fog that night was so thick, it was like paddling through wet concrete, as one Navy officer later described it. This was exactly what Ben needed. The fog was his shield. Their landing was executed on the southwestern shore, a section deemed impassable by Japanese intelligence due to the sheer cliffs and heavy surf, precisely why Ben chose it. They scrambled up the slick basalt cliffs, hauling their light gear. The ground above was a chaotic mix of black volcanic rock, spongy brown tundra, and the ghostly white of frozen lichen. Once ashore, their mission began. Total silence, total invisibility. Ben deployed his knowledge of the terrain instantly. He identified a faint, unused game trail, a path created by sea otters or Arctic foxes, and followed it, keeping them safely away from the likely paths of Japanese patrols. The sheer quietness of their movement was startling, even to his white companion. They moved not by sight, but by sound mapping, listening for the high-frequency thrum of generator motors, the distant clank of metal, or the faint, sharp smell of unburnt coal smoke, mapping the enemy perimeter by ear and nose. Their immediate reconnaissance confirmed command's worst fears. Kiska was heavily fortified. They found well-maintained anti-aircraft positions, massive bunkers dug deep into the hillsides, and an extensive network of barbed wire and booby traps guarding what they deduced were the main communication lines and tunnel entrances. They spotted evidence of a massive garrison, cooking smoke, fresh tracks in the mud, and the distant, rhythmic hammering that suggested the construction of even more fortifications. Ben's scouting was methodical. He did not rely on chance. He was reading the terrain as a Japanese general would. He realized the most critical tunnel entrances, those likely containing command posts or ammunition dumps, were hidden not at the bottom of the ravines, but cleverly concealed mid-slope, taking advantage of natural rock overhangs and drainages. He photographed these positions with a miniature camera, marking the coordinates using a specialized cold-resistant altimeter and sextant, bypassing the unreliable magnetic compass. After 48 hours of grueling continuous reconnaissance, Ben and his team had to make a crucial decision: continue scouting the main garrison or pull back with the vital intelligence they had. The fog remained their only protection, and it was about to betray them. As the fog began to lift slightly on the third day, Ben's team realized the Japanese patrols were operating with extreme diligence. They had clearly detected some subtle sign of infiltration. Ben and his partner suddenly stumbled upon a series of freshly laid tripwires and highly sensitive anti-personnel mines placed along a natural drainage path. It was a clear sign the enemy was actively hunting them. Ben immediately employed his most sophisticated skill: counter-tracking and deception. Using a method learned from centuries of hunting on thin ice, he reversed their tracks, placing pressure only on the heel of his specialized boot, making it appear as though one tired Japanese soldier had simply turned around. They then used a section of volcanic scree to eliminate all footprints before melting back into the higher elevations of the fog line. The intelligence they gathered was massive. They estimated the main garrison was indeed centered near Kiska Harbor, and they confirmed the presence of large anti-submarine netting and torpedo launching sites. But the closer they moved to the heart of the fortress, the more confusing the picture became. They found massive, intricate tunnel complexes, but the signs of recent activity were strangely contradictory. In one large bunker, they found fresh cigarette butts and a steaming kettle of water, indicating a recent presence. In an adjacent barracks, they found meticulous piles of discarded clothing, neatly arranged but smelling faintly of mothballs.
They located a large artillery emplacement near the summit of Kiska volcano, but the breech of the gun was clean and cold, showing no sign of recent firing. There were abundant tracks, but many seemed old, compressed by weather. It was a fortress that felt heavily used, but strangely empty. Ben, relying on his hunter's instinct, began to suspect something profound was wrong. A garrison of 10,000 men produces chaos, noise, and pervasive waste. This island was quiet, too quiet. He noted the pervasive scent of whale oil and burned rubber near the harbor, an unnatural odor that didn't fit with daily Japanese garrison life. They transmitted their updated intelligence back to the USS Wahoo via a secure, cold-proof radio burst. Their final report was a paradoxical message. Fortifications confirmed. Enemy presence strong but dispersed. Signs of recent activity contradicted by signs of deliberate recent cleanup. The subtlety was lost on command. The contradiction, filtered through the fear of another Atu, was interpreted simply as evidence of the Japanese being masters of deception and preparing a massive, fortified ambush. The military brass clung to the original estimate of 10,000 men. Ben and his team were exfiltrated just hours later, leaving behind an island they now understood far better than the commanders preparing to land 34,000 troops.
But Ben Kalluk's subtle observations about the deliberate cleanup and the strange smells were the keys to a masterstroke of Japanese evasion, a brilliant operation that was taking place simultaneously with his scouting mission. The Japanese High Command, realizing that holding Kiska was impossible following the devastating loss at Atu, had determined to evacuate the entire garrison. They planned an operation of logistical genius that relied entirely on the Aleutian weather. On the night of July 28, 1943, a thick, pervasive blanket of fog, a natural curtain, as the Japanese command called it, descended upon Kiska. Under the cover of this impenetrable weather, a fleet of cruisers and destroyers, moving with practiced silence, slipped into Kiska Harbor. The massive garrison of over 5,100 men, along with all their heavy equipment, medical supplies, and even the carefully removed breeches of their heaviest artillery, were loaded onto the ships. The strange smells Ben noticed near the harbor, burned rubber and whale oil, were the remnants of this massive evacuation. The deliberate cleanup was the Japanese strategy to leave behind an illusion of continued active occupation. They left behind steaming rice cookers, fresh cigarette butts, and strategically placed gear to ensure any aerial or naval reconnaissance would conclude that the fortress was still manned. They even left behind 3 dogs, who continued to bark and run the perimeter, simulating the sounds of patrol. The entire 5,100-man garrison vanished without a single shot fired by the Americans. The Japanese ships sailed away into the fog bank, undetected by the massive U.S. air and naval picket lines operating just miles away. Meanwhile, Ben's paradoxical report was being reviewed by an American command blinded by caution and the trauma of Atu. They concluded that the contradictory signs, the clean barracks, and the active patrol tracks were proof that the Japanese were prepared to let the initial landing waves penetrate the surface perimeter before unleashing a devastating counterattack from the deep tunnels. The threat level was raised from severe to catastrophic. The original invasion plan, Operation Cottage, was greenlit with an unprecedented scale of force. The invasion of Kiska, Operation Cottage, commenced on August 15, 1943. It was a massive, unprecedented display of military overkill. The Allied force consisted of 34,400 U.S. and Canadian troops supported by over 100 ships, including 5 battleships and a host of aircraft. The size of the invasion force dwarfed the estimated 10,000 Japanese defenders they expected to meet. The objective was simple: overwhelm the fortress and minimize American casualties. The first waves hit the beaches under the now familiar, oppressive curtain of fog and drizzle. They expected machine gun fire, booby traps, and the relentless screaming of a desperate enemy. What they met was silence. The soldiers advanced slowly,
painstakingly through the wire and up the hillsides. Every shadow was a sniper. Every dark tunnel entrance was an imminent ambush. The advance was characterized by extreme caution and high tension. Soldiers fired at shadows, at rocks, and at the ghostly white Arctic foxes that darted through the fog. The air was thick with the smell of anticipation and fear. Then came the terrible, ironic tragedy. The fear of the Japanese ambush turned inward. Due to poor visibility and overwhelming tension, the Allied forces began firing on each other. A series of disastrous friendly fire incidents occurred as units, confused by the fog and the terrain, mistook their comrades for the enemy. A single stray shot would trigger a massive, desperate exchange of fire. By the time the Allied forces reached Kiska Harbor, the heart of the supposed fortress, the truth became horrifyingly clear. The flags were flying, the dogs were barking, the rice cookers were still warm. But the island was utterly empty. The entire Japanese garrison had been gone for 2 weeks. Operation Cottage resulted in 168 Allied casualties, not from enemy action, but from friendly fire, mines, and logistical accidents, including a destroyer, the USS Abner Reed, hitting a mine that killed 70 men. The island was taken, but the battle was against ghosts. Sergeant Ben Kalluk's subtle report about the deliberate cleanup had been completely vindicated, but the military machine, once set in motion, could not be stopped by the nuanced observations of a small local scout. Immediate aftermath of the invasion of ghosts was a mix of immense relief and profound, embarrassing frustration. The U.S. military had successfully recaptured Kiska, securing the Aleutians and eliminating the last enemy foothold in North America. But the cost was a painful lesson in military rigidity and the consequence of fear. The world realized that the massive invasion had been a spectacular, bloody, and entirely unnecessary parade of force. The legacy of the Alaskan Scouts and men like Sergeant Ben Kalluk stands in stark contrast to the waste of Operation Cottage. The Scouts, through their knowledge, their patience, and their respect for the environment, successfully navigated the most challenging terrain and delivered accurate, subtle intelligence. Their methods, relying on observation, tracking, and non-instrument navigation, were far superior to the high-altitude photography and naval reconnaissance relied upon by the commanders. The Scouts were the first Americans to confirm the Japanese position on Kiska and the first to raise the alarm about the contradictory signs of evacuation. While their warnings were initially dismissed, their eventual contribution to the war effort was undeniable. They continued to serve as expert guides, trackers, and survival instructors for the forces that remained on the Aleutians, turning their immense indigenous knowledge into a vital military asset. After the war, the Alaskan Scouts were officially disbanded. Like many specialized units drawn from indigenous populations, the men returned to their homes, their crucial role in securing America's only occupied territory often forgotten by mainstream history. They received little public recognition, their quiet mastery of the tundra simply fading back into the landscape. Today, Kiska remains a silent, windswept testament to the extremes of World War II. The island is littered with abandoned machinery, rusting equipment, and the empty, cold entrances to the massive tunnel networks. The story of the Alaskan Scouts is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most sophisticated military intelligence doesn't come from satellites or code-breaking machines, but from the quiet, intimate knowledge held by those who call the hostile land home. Ben Kalluk's eyes, trained by a lifetime of hunting in the fog, saw a truth that thousands of troops and billions of dollars in hardware could not grasp. The enemy was gone, defeated not by bullets, but by logistics and the silent, ever-present curtain of the Aleutian fog.